All right, so John, it is great to be talking to you again. I can't remember the last time we did this. I think it was a couple of years ago. I don't know, more or less. Um, Political time is weird these days, and that's the timeline I think you and I both live on to some extent. Um, you, John, what's your official position at Braver Angels?
Yeah. Well, so it's great to be back on here with you, Robin. I enjoyed our conversation last time around, however many years ago it was. It's all a bit of a blur at this point. Yeah, no, feels like yesterday. Now that you're here in front of me, I am the a national ambassador for Braver Angels, which is just sort of a fancy way of saying something of a roaming spokesperson for the organization. But I'm also our director of media development and public outreach. Like most of my colleagues within the organization, I wear a number of different hats, but I've been pleased to play a leading role in terms of articulating the values and the vision of Braver Angels and informing the public about just what precisely it is that we do. So you can definitely identify my work in that capacity.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to ask you to actually tell the people watching this what your work is, what it is that you exactly do. But before that, if you'll bear with me, because I know I told you this before we started recording, but again, for the benefit of people watching us having this chat, the reason I want to talk to you now, John, is that we've launched Humilitarian, and people can go to humanitarian.us to see what that's all about. But people who are identifying humanitarian, basically meaning that they're declaring themselves passionate about the kind of principles of political discourse and mutual respect that you and I care about. A lot of those folks are saying, okay, well, what can we do now? And there are a number of organizations like Brave Angels that are doing great things in the United States to improve political discourse, to increase mutual respect among people with different views that may have previously distrusted each other. Or maybe so ideologically separate that conversations are difficult. And you and I both believe that bridging those gaps is critical, right? That maybe the way we conduct politics is at least as important as the policies we end up pushing. So I wanted to speak to you again so that people who found Humilitarian can understand Braver Angels as a resource, and I want Humilitarian to be a hub for folks, for organizations like you. I want to help them find organizations like Braver Angels. So with all of that said, please now give us the paragraph pitch. What does Braver Angels do, and why is it important?
That's right. So Braver Angels is the United States' largest grassroots bipartisan organization dedicated to the work of political depolarization. But I would like to deepen our understanding of what depolarization means, to go beyond just creating a civil context within which people may communicate, to imply even more deeply sort of restoring the context for a genuine culture of community to be built between our disparate partisan and social tribes in a manner that essentially reanimates the spirit of democracy in America to be as broad and inclusive and as functional as we would like it to be in a diverse and complex society. And so Braver Angels is a membership organization. We've got, I think, probably in the area of 12,000 dues paid members across the states. We have about 60 or more local Braver Angels alliances. You could think of them as local chapters, but these are bipartisan local communities of Braver Angels members who work together to multiply our workshops and programs where we convene folks from different sides and who also work together collaborating on issues, political and community issues where there is bipartisan concern and the opportunity to work together, right? We are active on college campuses. We work with elected officials and their staffs from the congressional all the way down to the municipal level. And we are active in the media. We have our own fledgling media network. Of course, I'm here speaking to you from our studio. I'm co-host of the Braver Angels podcast. We've got a team of writers, social media team, et cetera, et cetera. So we're active across fronts. And in all of that, what we are building is a national civic community that links together local communities of people from every side of our politics who want to come together and reunite on the basis of our deeper shared values as Americans and as human beings, right? And so it is a ground level up effort to instill a new culture of community, or a revivified culture of community within American politics, in a way that we hope to see stabilize our institutions and our democratic culture over the course of time. So it's a big thing, and we're glad to have the support of folks like yourself.
No, absolutely. So I would like you to explain what it is. What are the experiences that somebody's going to start to have once they join Braver Angels?
Sure.
And before you do, I just would like to say that with the exact goal that you have so nicely articulated, and I know you've probably articulated it hundreds of times, the purpose, no, it was beautiful. The purpose of Humilitarian is actually for people to give themselves a label and identity, so that the folks who want to do all of the things that you have just said can identify each other. You talked about, I think, a membership of, I think you said 12,000. What I would like to see happen is, 12,000, 120,000, 1.2 million, say, yes, that makes sense. That's what we need. Therefore, I'm a humanitarian. I have this vision of people around the country saying, yeah, I'm a humanitarian Democrat. I'm a humanitarian Republican. I'm a humanitarian Libertarian, whatever it might be. Just so then, if large numbers of us have a word to identify our buying into all the things you've just said, we become a political force. Because then we can be identified, we identify each other, and the establishment can identify us. And then it kind of puts politics on notice that we care about these values in the way we're conducting our politics, and not just if you've got an R by your name. So I just wanted to say that, so kind of I'm making sense of the join here, the convergence between what you're doing as an organization and what I want to achieve with the Humilitarian Project. So having said all of that, please, what happens when somebody joins Braver Angels?
Absolutely. And well, first of all, I'd like to say that you can put me on record as identifying myself as a humanitarian. I think that it is a phrase that captures the total sort of spirit of the character of citizenship that we want to embody in the work that we do at Braver Angels. And so again, I applaud you for it. But Braver Angels, so participation in Braver Angels gives you the opportunity to do a range of different things. And I should say that our programs have touched many more people than actually join us as members, right? And so Braver Angels is an ongoing community. But so to give you a sense of some of these activities, the first activity for which Braver Angels was known is something that we call a red-blue workshop. So this is a module where we will take a small group of individuals, some from the right, some from the left, or reds and blues, as we say in-house. We bring them together not so much to argue or debate politics, but to speak from the perspective of their own personal or lived experience in terms of why they see politics the way that they do. And so it's a model that was designed by Professor Bill Doherty, co-founder of Braver Angels, one of America's foremost marriage counselors. It is literally marriage counseling applied to the relationship between Republicans and Democrats, right? And so through guided exercise, we give each side the opportunity to hear the internal dialogue taking place on the other side of the conversation. And so we have something called a stereotypes exercise. Each group separates. They go and they list stereotypes that they see the other side is having about them. Conservatives will generally have a list that starts with, oh, the other side thinks that blues think that we're racist. Blues will have a list that oftentimes starts with something like, oh, reds, they think that we all hate America, or we want the government to run everybody's lives. And each side has the opportunity to present that list of stereotypes and in their own terms articulate why they disagree with those stereotypes. Each side also speaks to what they think the kernel of truth in those stereotypes might be. So Republicans may be likely to say something like, look, the vast majority of us are not racist people, but there are people who vote Republican who are racist, and we should make sure that those folks don't feel comfortable in our movement. Or you'll have progressives saying, look, the vast majority of us love America, but you do have some of us who have maybe sort of a cynical attitude towards the country, and sometimes it can be important for us to reflect on the good things that America has done and not be so critical that we lose sight of that, right? So these are common examples. In that workshop, there's also something called a fishbowl. Each side will have an internal conversation within their own group about why they're conservative or why they're progressive, why they believe what they believe, while the other group sits quietly on the outside of the fishbowl and just listens. And so that's a valuable thing when you think that most of our appreciation of what the other side thinks, how it is that they come to their values, is mediated for us through the distorted lens of a partisan media. So, cable news, talk radio, social media will tend to give us a vision of the other side that is highly pejorative and inexact. So these sorts of programs give people the opportunity to see past that. There's much more. We have workshops dedicated to teaching communicative skills. So our Skills for Bridging the Divide workshop gives people techniques to apply to conversations in terms of how you can go about having a dialogue across political differences that really works. The importance of using I statements as opposed to, quote, truth statements, coming from acknowledging your own subjectivity and framing your point of view. The value in being able to paraphrase accurately what the other person's point is in language that is actually close to what they themselves would use to describe it, as opposed to characterizing their opinion in a way that is demeaning or clearly, triggering. We have something called a Braver Angels debate program, which has been wildly popular online. This originally was an in-person program, but then with the advent of the COVID-19 and the lockdown, we transitioned that in our other programs in the virtual space and have seen an explosion actually in the rate of participation in them. Our Braver Angels debate model, designed by my colleague April Lawson, is one that is based in parliamentary procedure. The history of it is it's modeled on the Yale Student Union debate model, which itself I think comes from the British parliamentary system. You may have seen it once or twice. And but the virtue of it is that with a chairperson in the middle of the floor, we bring people together from all walks of life. And I mean that not just politically, but professionally. We'll have experts in the room. We'll have working class folks in attendance. A resolution will be put on the table, resolved, local government should defund the police, agree or disagree. Each side will get an opportunity, each person who wants to participate gets an opportunity to give a short speech addressing the issue. Then they get to take questions from other participants. But the speakers and the other participants don't speak directly to each other. The speech is given to the gathering, but questions are addressed to the chairperson. And that's because we want this to be about the honest sharing of ideas and experiences and not the competition of egos and personalities. And so our model encourages intellectual humility. It encourages intellectual honesty and reflection. We encourage people to speak from what they believe, but to be honest where they have doubts, to be honest where they think their own arguments might be weak in a certain area. And people are even allowed to change their mind midway through the event if they hear something from somebody else that causes them to reflect on their own position and come away with a different point of view. And so all of these things, all of these activities are valuable resources in and of themselves, but collectively they constitute a range of community building vehicles that allow us to build a culture within Braver Angels together, whereby those who continue on an active involvement in Braver Angels as members of their local alliance, etc., find deeper and deeper ways to build relationships with each other and to learn from one another, so that as they go back out into the wild world of American politics, they find themselves better and better armed to express their convictions and to work with people from any walk of life, in the context of our democratic society. So yeah, that's it in a walloping nutshell.
I love it. I absolutely love it. Now, you've been doing this. Brave Angels have been going for some time, years now. What
Well,
what?
you know, as a formal organization, we didn't really get started until about the spring of 2017. It
Mhm.
feels like a long time because it's been the wildest, you know, three,
Yeah.
4 years in recent
Well,
American history.
that's years. That's
But yeah,
years. Yeah, and a week is a long time
yeah,
in politics, right?
that's
As
right.
they say.
Mhm.
But
That's
I
right.
guess what we're talking about here is political culture. And what I
Mhm.
was going to ask you in that time, whether it's long or short, have what have you come to believe, if anything, about the trajectory we're on,
Mhm.
and on any kind of optimism pessimism scale? Um,
Mhm.
where, what chance do you think we've got?
Right. Well, so you're talking to the eternal optimist, I have to say, simply because I have a deep-seated belief in the ability of committed individuals and committed groups of people, communities, to ultimately make impacts that go well beyond, you know, our immediate numbers. And in so doing, I think we managed to grow those numbers over time as well. I think that there is momentum behind the consolidating and the blossoming of a larger sort of unity type of movement in America, and it's difficult to describe in uniform terms because you have the depolarization space. You've got not only Braver Angels but National Conversations Project, Bridge Alliance, and
Yeah,
a whole group of other organizations who are doing work in this vein. You've got a small, but I think intensifying philanthropic network of folks who are and foundations who are willing to support this kind of work and related work. You've got a sprawling sort of intellectual dark web kind of subculture that is not necessarily primarily about depolarization per se, but within which that is a subject of dialogue, and it is heterodox. It is, you know, the online space in general seems to be inviting people to have cross-partisan conversations in a way that allows for a great deal of opportunity. You have high-level folks in politics and culture. I mean, from Sarah Silverman to Van Jones to Cornel West to Glenn Beck, who are speaking to the need for us to begin to transcend these tribal divisions, and that lets me know that there is cultural momentum behind a
yeah,
transformation in the heart of our democratic personality. Now, having said all that, obviously the reason that energy is swelling is because it's swelling in response to perhaps a much bigger cancer, or maybe a assortment of tumors in the culture and the spirit of our body politic, right? And so I think for the last several years we've seen so much of the political activity in America, um, whether it's leveraged through the parties or spilling out into other areas of American life, being driven by the most polarized voices in the conversation, right? And I
yes,
think that those voices led really to the nomination of Donald Trump on the Republican side. And on the left, you've seen this spill out into, you know, a sort of social justice activism that has, you know, brought a certain degree of chaos and unrest to college campuses and to American cities and communities. And I think that the thing that I want to pause to say about each side of that is that, you know, it's easy in the space that we're operating in to be dismissive of the reasons why people become polarized to begin with. But, you know, all of these folks are motivated by social grievances that, you know, we ought to take the time to understand. I mean, I think that so much of the base of President Trump's support has been working class folks who feel themselves left behind by the powers that be in the Democratic and the Republican establishments, people who felt that the popular culture had just sort of dismissed them, and that, you know, people across this country, but particularly the coastal elites in New York and California, didn't want to see these, you know, working class folks in the Rust Belt and in the South as genuinely, you know, a part of the America that they wanted to see reflected, you know, to the world or to ourselves. And in communities of color in urban and inner city environments and across just the arc of American history to now, you've got marginalized communities who I think with a fair degree of justification feel themselves locked out of not just the larger scope of opportunities in American society to whatever degree, but who also feel themselves not perfectly meshed with the predominant culture in American society that they feel was not constructed with their cultures and norms and identities in mind. And people feel that that reflects itself in the outcomes of our policies and our social disparities, et cetera. And, people have real reasons for feeling that way. So
what you just said there, John, if I may, this feeling of kind of alienation from one's own culture and one's own political culture, I think that's something that those Trump supporters that you mentioned and some of those more justice-focused, social justice-focused folks on the left could both say of their experience and motivation, right? Maybe there's something quite deep in common that the different extremes, right, dichotomous extremes of our politics have at the moment. And I think maybe you just nailed it.
Yeah, well, alienation, alienation, disenfranchisement is actually, it is the same general starting point for the social grievances that actually pit these alienated groups most fervently against each other, right? So there's an irony in that. And what's interesting about what seems at least to be, I mean, we still, at the time you and I are talking, there's litigation being pushed by the Trump administration and folks in the Republican Party, seeking to uncover voter fraud and so forth. But if it is in fact the case that Joe Biden has been elected and that perhaps Mitch McConnell remains as majority leader of the United States Senate, what you have is a situation where all of this populist animus led to this tremendous presidential collision, and the result of that is maybe something of a resurgence of the political establishments, although not in so dominant a position as they ever were before, I think. Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell, if that winds up becoming the bipartisan axis of power in Washington, then these are literally the most establishment figures you can think of from either party. But should Donald Trump step down, somebody I follow tweeted out saying something along the lines of, the Trump administration is ending, Trumpism is beginning, or something like that. And meanwhile, you've got the Young Turks sort of, vowing to, I think, be the tail that wags the dog, and alongside other progressives and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and folks from what you could loosely call, I guess, the populist left. Those forces are not going away. If anything, I think they're reconsolidating. But what you observe across the country, broadly speaking, I think, is a desire to see some stability return to America, and on the cultural and institutional level, a desire to see some wounds healed for the sake of this country and our politics. And I do think that Joe Biden, tentatively President-elect Joe Biden, perhaps, is deliberately seeking to speak to that social aspiration of the American people, which I think he very much should, and I'm glad to see that. So, goes back to the idea that there's perhaps momentum in all directions. Yeah. There's momentum in the direction of further polarization, but I think that there is momentum in the direction of our being able to build across these divides again. And as this space, this depolarization, unity-minded space matures, I think we'll see the infrastructure develop by which that is made possible. And so obviously Braver Angels seeks to take a leading role in that effort.
So now, when you talk about the infrastructure, yes, we're seeing it. We've been seeing it for a few years, organizations like yours, and now the Humilitarian Project and all these other things are starting up. But what we're really talking about is, hopefully, an actual change in the political culture. If that actually happens, that will mean there will be a change in, let's say, the political infrastructure that is associated with the Democratic Party, with the Republican Party. It will feel different to operate inside those parties, as well as in organizations like Braver Angels and so on. That seems like that's a big thing to imagine. Do you think, for example, you mentioned Biden, and I think you and I both listened to his speech where he certainly spoke to some of the kind of concerns of division that we're interested in. Do you actually think that that could happen, that we could see the change inside the parties, or are they going to be not only the last to get the memo, because maybe they've got, as parties, as private institutions, the biggest reason, motivation to not buy in to this improved discourse? Or do you think in the next few years we're going to see exactly that? We're going to see that it does feel different to be a Democrat or Republican. You feel different when you watch a McConnell or a Biden speaking to the nation than we feel right now, or that we have felt in the last few years when we've listened to our leaders. Can you imagine it?
Right. Yeah. So, yes, I can imagine it. But I do think that this process is going to be a highly uneven one. So political parties are funny things as kind of, institutional organisms. On the one hand, I think that political parties want fundamentally to be responsive to shifts in culture, because ultimately political parties tend to come into existence as the product of whatever social consensus may exist within a certain zone of constituencies within a political society, but they evolve according to the evolving preferences of whatever constituencies they may represent or come to represent, as certain coalitions begin to form and others may break and dissolve. And so I think that a movement in American culture towards a greater sense of unity and transcendence, and a deeper sense of connection that allows for us to maintain our ideological identities without prioritizing them over our shared American identity. I think that the parties would ultimately have to respond to that, and their characters would tend to change. On the other hand, you just can't underestimate the degree to which political parties also operate as self-serving organisms who have a status quo of influencers, people who hold power through the mechanisms of the party, people who, have whether ideological or just sort of professional interests in maintaining a certain operative status quo. The parties, the culture of polarization as it exists in America today is one that the parties have evolved in response to, one that they have helped catalyze, and one that they currently lean upon, even if perhaps you have some folks within the parties who are wise enough to see that, it's not good for the long-term interests of society. So these trends are in direct tension or opposition to each other. And so, I think that we will see movement, but it is going to come in the context of some pretty visceral social collisions that I think eventually are going to start spilling out between sort of the ethos of community building within democracy on the one hand, and the partisan instincts on the other. And the question will simply be, where does the greater momentum ultimately, prove itself to lie? And over the course of time, I'm very confident that the humanitarian character of the American people will see its way to victory in this context. But there's a way in which we're just at the beginning of this.
Yeah. I mean, again, you've described the processes at play so well. My purpose with Humilitarian was that we make it in the self-interest of the sometimes regressive big parties to respond to the kind of things we're talking about when they know that the constituency that is demanding that response is out there and it's sufficiently large. And that's why I thought coming up with the word for that constituency to self-identify with, right, to actually use, is so important. there may be tens of millions, there may be hundreds of millions of Americans that want us to go in the direction that we're talking about here. But the politicians need to know that we're there and that we're in enough, we have enough numbers that we can actually change elections such that their self-interest also becomes humanitarian. And so, yeah, I'm, that's exactly what I guess I'm trying to advance with this.
Agreed. Yeah. I mean, there's got to be, it is worthwhile to work with well-placed people in government and media. I mean, there's a top-down aspect to this, but fundamentally.
It goes both ways, right? It's always both ways, right?
Well, that's right. That's right. But in order for the institutional character to really shift, there has to be a serious gravitational pull from the demand level up,
right?
Right.
Yeah.
So if we can change the nature of the demand, then we can change the nature of the supply. And, that's, and I think that that's well within our ultimate ability to do. I mean, it's funny, strategically speaking, a lot of people think that you've got to get the most prominent politicians to start changing the way they do things and have that filter down, maybe in economics, there's a strong argument, or, depending on the prejudices of your listeners, I don't know if it goes one way or the other, but you can say what you will about supply side economics, but supply side social change only takes you so far, so we could go deeper into that, but yeah, you're on the right track in the way you're explaining this.
Yeah, and I think your point there about supply side social change only going so far, that relates to your earlier point, which I might characterize as, politics can only do what the culture allows it to do. Right. It kind of, there's many, I mean, we talk about the Overton window, you like to say easily, simply you can just say culture precedes politics. There are lots of variations of it. But yeah, that's definitely so. So where do you think, I don't know how long we've been speaking here. I think we've gone more than half an hour, so I don't want to keep you much longer for now, John. But where do you think we are? You mentioned that we're talking at a time when Biden, let's say, has won the presidential election. There are challenges from Trump and his folks. Right now, describe the times we're in right now. If there's any more to say than you already have, perhaps you've already said all the things that need to be said.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think that we're obviously in a moment of transition. And I think that, well, first of all, I do expect that President Trump, should it turn out to be the case that he was defeated according to all reasonable evidence, will leave office, and whether he does so in a particularly gracious way or not is another question. But I think that for folks who have a certain amount of anxiety still, that, we may be looking at a scenario where the institutions utterly break down because, maybe the president doesn't want to acknowledge the results of the election, or maybe, hypothetically, significant fraud is discovered and the Democrats don't accept it. I think I am optimistic that we will avoid that, and that there will be a transition of power, an orderly transition by and large. I'm hopeful, but that's where we are in this precise moment, is waiting through to see if we can pull that off the way we always have in America.
Yeah.
And so, but coming out of that, I think that we just have a fundamental decision that we will begin to have to make in American life as to whether or not we want to begin rebuilding a shared sense of American identity that transcends the partisan and the tribal ones, and you'll have partisan conversations over, how, sort of a Trumpian style of conservatism can maintain influence on the right and retake the country. You'll have conversations over how an anti-racist social justice movement can sweep deeper into the institutions on the left and lead the Democratic mainstream. But the question is ultimately, will the American people begin to speak in terms of mending these divides. And like I've already said, I have a fair amount of optimism that things will move in that direction. Part of that, though, is just because I operate from within the center of the currently relatively small universe that is actively seeking to do so. But the demand for what it is we do is only continued to rise, right?
Yeah.
And I think that the consequences of our divisions will only continue to present themselves. So, yeah, we're in a moment of choosing. I think the nature of the choice, however, is gradually making itself clear to people that this isn't fundamentally a choice between left and right. It is fundamentally a choice between a politics of demonization and a politics of humanization.
Yes.
And I think that we will ultimately choose the latter course.
And that's a choice between positive sum politics and negative sum politics. And we've been kind of driving hard into negative sum politics. So do you think that if there's a time lag between, let's say, the establishment Democrats and the establishment Republicans realizing or noticing the demand for positive sum politics, let's call it, that in that time lag, they will continue or they will move to further towards the ideological extremes, or not necessarily?
Well, you know, it is a good question because I do think that the establishments in each party, I mean, Trump, I guess, sort of became the establishment more or less, but the old guard in the Republican Party and the establishment in the Democratic Party, I think that they've recaptured some of what they lost in 2016. And so that could, and I don't, mean to put myself forward here as just sort of like as a champion for the establishments by any means, because frankly, the establishments and the parties, sort of earned their defenestration, I think.
And as we said earlier, kind of caused the problem by alienating so many of the people they were supposed to represent, to a large extent.
Indeed. But it is more likely that folks in those elements of the party are going to be willing to nudge towards a culture of compromise in government that may be more conducive to the catalyzing, or at least more harmonious with the spreading of a communal building and depolarizing spirit in the body politic, generally speaking. But again, I think that, you're going to see, it may be that the most intense fights we see are within the parties going forward as opposed to between the parties. I mean, I can imagine a scenario where, yes, maybe we have gridlock in Washington, but, maybe Republicans are not trashing, Joe Biden, and Senate Democrats are not trashing, Mitch McConnell in anywhere quite as extreme a way as was the case with Democrats to Trump and Republicans to Obama. It hopefully it provides the space for, some more constructive, some healthier narratives to begin to emerge. But that said, I don't want to go too deep into the prediction.
No, wise. Yeah, never make predictions, especially about the future, as they say, right? Do you maybe we'll end with this, because I think if it follows on from the thoughts you were just sharing. I don't know if you're in a position to answer this question, but if so, I'd be interested in your view. Do you see difference between partisan behaviors at the local and at the state and at the national level in terms of discourse, in terms of political culture?
Well, as a very general rule, you're going to have to take it with many grains of salt, because the United States is a big country and different states and different cities are very different from one another. But as a general rule, what had always been true was that on the municipal level, on the local level, it's been far easier for people to find common ground across their partisan divisions than has been the case on the national level. Or on the state level. And that's because it's sort of obvious, but people who live close to each other get the opportunity to know one another better. They're able to see each other past the stereotypes, and their self-interest, their common interest, their shared interests are more conspicuous. You know, we've got to get the potholes filled. Let's pause the debate on abortion for a moment. You know, but over the course of our work, you know, I mean, I've spoken to leagues of mayors and in different states and so forth, and chambers of commerce and so on and so forth. The national polarization in many places has crept into local politics, right? But I still think that so much of the arsenal for reconciliation in America is going to be found on the local level. And so now different states, depending on the character of the state, are probably going to reflect either more or less of the national polarization or more or less of the greater tendency on the local level for people to be able to find some common ground. State of California is a country in and of itself, really, you know, and as where I live. I'm in Los Angeles. And so, you know, but it's also a state dominated by a single party, by the Democratic Party. And so much of, I mean, you do have bitter divisions between Democrats and Republicans statewide. Our partisan campaigns can get very ugly in a way that tends to mirror the national politics. But the balance of power tends to be one that on the statewide level, it has to be decided on from between factions of the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
And so you see the splits within the Democratic Party emerge in ways that are, you know, probably pretty ugly and conspicuous on the state level here. And you know, I imagine you tend to see similar things happening in other states as well. But the more national you get, the harder it is to broker a culture that is empathetic and aiming towards a greater unity. That's why working in the local community level and scaling up the norms that we can begin to rebuild in terms of civil discourse and the proper practice of politics. It's one that can scale up nationally, but it has to really dig its fingers into the dirt locally, I think, for the whole thing to be viable.
I'd like to see some, maybe it's a bit of a fantasy, but I'd like to see in the next few years, some candidates who discover humanitarian say, whether they're running as a Democrat or Republican for local office, say, I'm running as a humanitarian Democrat or Republican. And the voters start to make political decisions based on that stated approach to politics, rather than by prioritizing ideology per se. And but you know, who knows?
Yeah. Well, if we can build the constituency for that type of politics, the politicians will follow.
Exactly. Yeah, and this is the demand and the supply again, right? So look, John, I am so grateful for your time and for this conversation and for your insights. You are so clear and articulate, and therefore helpful to those who hear you, and I'm very grateful. And I hope we get to do this again soon, and I hope also some of the optimistic suggestions that have been made, or I didn't say predictions, suggestions that have been made in our chat here come to pass sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Indeed. Yeah, thank you, Robin. It's always a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to next time.
Absolutely.